केलं सर. इट्स ऑन. करू सर ऍडमिट ऑल.
हो.
आणि आता ब्लॉक करून टाकला.
झालं.
अरे माझं गेलंच ते.
काय
स्क्रीनच गेला. तो कुठे गेला?
नाही, शेअर स्क्रीन स्टॉप कर ना.
वॉइस येत नाहीये.
व्हॉइस
किर्लोस्करला
सर इट्स देअर. व्हॉइस कोणालाच येत नाहीये.
नाही, मला ऐकू येते.
मला येतं ऐकू.
चैतन्य तुझं हे आहे, ऑल आर सीइंग वेल. Someone is saying we can hear you people. चल.
वी कॅन हिअर यू. नुपूरचा आलाय ना. डॉक्टर अमोल, कॅन यू चेक युअर ऑडिओ? हा आला सर किर्लोस्कर सरांचा की. ओके. सर तुमचं झालं की मग देन आय स्टार्ट शेअरिंग द स्क्रीन.
पण शेअर तुमच्याच बरोबर आहे. आता तू माझाच सुरू करणार आहेस ना?
हो हो, तुम्ही स्टार्ट करू शकता सर. आवाज
Shall we start?
या.
Welcome everybody. I welcome you all on behalf of Pune Obstetrics and Gynecological Society. And today we are going to have another nice session on connect with experts. And in these sessions, we are going to be talking about basics. In basics, we are going to have 2 lectures, and to preside over this or to conduct this session, we have 2 chairpersons, Dr. Milind Duggad. Dr. Milind Duggad is the Executive Vice President of our society, and he is also a senior gynecologist practicing in Pune. Along with him, we have Dr. Prakash Kothave, who also happens to be treasurer of Pune Society, and he has also been practicing in Pune for the last couple of years. So without wasting any further time, I would request Milind to take over and conduct the proceedings.
Hello everybody. Sir, good morning to everybody. Let's start this webinar. This is the 3rd webinar, Connect to Experts. The previous 2 webinars were by Dr. Jatin Shah and on infertility, and second was by Dr. Khorana on ultrasonography. This is today's webinar is on basics of semen analysis and semen preparation. The first lecture will be delivered by Dr. Ashwini Kade. She did her DNB from KEM Hospital. She did her fellow in embryology from NUH Singapore. She is presently secretary POJS 2020-21. She was joint secretary POJS 2018 and 19. Chief IVF consultant from Asha Kiran Hospital. Chief embryologist in Asha IVF Center Pune. Joint clinical secretary POJS 16 and 17. Peer reviewer of Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecological of India, and she was a treasurer of MSR for year 2018 and 20. I request Dr. Ashwini to start her first lecture, that is sperm analysis and semen preparation.
Can you see the
Over
screen?
to Ashwini.
Thank you, Prakash sir. Is the screen visible now?
Yes.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Harshad sir for giving us this opportunity of speaking in this Connect with Experts. And on behalf of POJS, I would like to welcome you all to this third webinar in the series. We would start with basics of semen analysis and semen preparation. Mainly, we'll cover it for IUI. So 1 minute, my screen, yeah. As we all know that subfertility occurs in more than 1 in 10 couples, and the reduced semen quality is implicated in approximately 50% of these cases. So how to check for male subfertility? We basically have to remember one thing, that whenever you check for male subfertility, semen analysis is only a part of your workup when you label any male as subfertile. So you have to always start with the detailed history of the patient, the age of the patient. Even age of a male for that matter is very important, as we know that the semen count, motility decreases with increasing age. You have to take a detailed history of all the habits: alcohol intake, tobacco smoking, coital history, drug use and abuse, past medical and surgical history, because many a times patients don't give a proper history of orchidectomy done in the past. And then finally it comes to semen analysis. Which is a part of this workup. And then comes the hormonal evaluation and genetic test, which are to be specifically done once the semen analysis is done. These tests are not to be routinely advised for each and every patient. Doing these tests would depend on your semen analysis report. Now, the second part is the workup of both the partners of male and female is always to be done simultaneously. We should not first wait for the male partner to be treated or diagnosed and then move to the female partner, or vice versa, because treating both of them simultaneously would give you better results. We'll just go back to the basics a little. This is the male reproductive tract, in which testis produces spermatozoa. We have got a bilateral pair of testes. Then comes epididymis, where the sperms mature and the storage happens there. And it is here that they achieve carnitin and hence the motility. The vas deferens, which is also a storage site, is also the transport for these sperms. Then the seminal vesicles, which basically secrete fructose and which composes 50% of the semen volume. And hence checking for fructose and having an intact seminal vesicle is very important. Then prostate contributes to about 40% of the semen volume. It contains citric acid, acid phosphatase, various proteolytic enzymes and zinc. And 1 to 2% comes from bulbourethral glands. So semen analysis is basically, recommended for investigation of the semen quality. The cutoff values are defined by the WHO manual, which came in 2010. Initially, it was way back in 1999, which we used to follow. But after this 2010 manual, there's been huge changes in it. There are different forms of male infertility, which have been described based on these values. We basically have to differentiate them as oligospermia, where the count is low, asthenospermia, which depends on their motility, teratozoospermia, and the combination of this, which is called as OATS. So semen analysis, the most important part of semen analysis is always collection. The collection should be very proper. The doctor or the lab technician or the embryologist, whoever does this, should always talk to the patient, counsel the male patient regarding how you are going to do it, when you are going to do it, because even the male partner has to be prepared to produce semen sample on that very day, and that too in the said premises. As we all know that the initial sample is always sperm rich, so that is why the collection has to be very meticulous in a valve-mouthed container, which is to be labeled. Because at times it happens that as the semen comes in spurts, the initial sample may just spill off, and whatever is collected is just the prostatic secretions, which may contain only mucus and not sperm. And this kind of a male may wrongly be labeled as azoospermic. There should be a proper hand wash before collection. The ideal abstinence should be of 3 to 5 days. A lesser abstinent would give you false result wherein the semen volume may be low, and you may think of the patient having as azoospermia or low semen volume. And anything more than 5 days would also give you varied results. It should preferably not be a condom collection, as we all know that condom is spermicidal. The collection should be in the lab only, or wherever you're going to check for the semen, it should be in the same premises. And when the semen is home collected or collected at any other premises, you specifically have to mention it on your paper that the semen was brought from outside. I preferably always take a separate consent wherein it is very clearly written that such and such sample is brought by so and so person from outside. Now, what if there is no semen in the lab? If the patient is not able to collect semen on that day? So you have to rule out two important things. One is retrograde ejaculation. That is when the sperm, instead of coming out in the ejaculate, would go in the urine or in the urinary bladder. And second important is erectile dysfunction. So how do you differentiate these two? In retrograde ejaculation, the patient has no erectile dysfunction. The erection is absolutely normal. You have to differentiate from aspermia, which is nothing but absent semen. There in retrograde ejaculation, very little or no semen is produced. And when you centrifuge the urine sample, you would find the presence of sperm. So always whenever a patient gives a history of retrograde ejaculation, you should always see for the urine sample, and you cannot just scan the entire urine, but you have to centrifuge the urine sample and then see for the sediment where you will find sperms. Erectile dysfunction, it can either be temporary, which is generally the case in 10 to 20% of the male patients, which is related to stress, anxiety, or you could call it performance pressure. A simple counseling, calming down the patient helps in these cases. Or even if that doesn't help and the patient is still not able to give a sample, you could try treating him medically with just 1 or 2 doses of sildenafil. And at times, if the patient has long-standing cases, the patient himself gives a history of erectile dysfunction. So in such cases, in long-standing chronic cases, you could try a vibrator or maybe testicular sperm extractions. So this is basically a summary of the WHO 2010 criteria. I'll go one by one into the details of all these parameters. WHO mentions a semen volume of 1.5 to 3 ml as normal. But in the Indian scenario, even a semen volume of 1 ml is to be taken as normal, because many a times it happens that a semen volume in the range of 1 to 1.5 ml is also taken as normal. The total sperm number, that is sperm per ejaculate, which is taken as normal, is 39 million. Sperm concentration, that is sperm per ml, should be 15, which was initially taken as 20 million, has now come down to 15 million. Now coming to the total motility, a normal motility of 40% is normal, of which progressive motility should be more than 32%. The vitality, that is the living sperms, should be 58%, and the sperm morphology should be 4%. That is only 4% normal sperms are even all right or okay to give a pregnancy. Now mind well, these are all lower reference limit or the lower values. These are not absolute values. So anything less than that would not give you a pregnancy is the basic fallacy of this WHO 2010 criteria. So we have to know that this is just the lower limit of all the counts and criteria. So now coming, so this is how once the semen is in your lab, so this is how one by one, step by step, you start assessing it. First, you look for liquefaction. Then you see for the appearance or the color of the semen. You measure the semen volume till then. Then you look for the pH only if it is required. Then you prepare a wet preparation to see for the microscopy, especially the motility. Then in case you find any problems with motility, you would check for vitality. At times, you have to make spears for sperm morphology. Then you assess the sperm concentration. And in few required and indicated cases, you may even do the immunoglobulin test. Then the peroxidase positive cells for pus cells. And then you centrifuge the sample either to be used for IUI, for cryopreservation. Now, once the semen is in the lab, this is the volume that you look at. So any less volume could be because of improper collection, spillage, or a short abstinence. But the most important cause of a low volume with absent fructose and azoospermia is to be remembered is congenital bilateral absence of vas deferens or vas aplasia, and in few cases, ejaculatory duct obstruction. So this important cause of azoospermia with low volume is often missed out in about 80 to 90% of the cases because they never give a history of low volume, and in such low volumes, doing a fructose becomes problematic. Now coming to the color, it should always be homogeneous and gray opalescent in appearance. It should never be white or cloudy. If it appears less opaque, if the sperm concentration is very low. The color may also be different as if it contains RBCs or blood, it is hemospermia, which can be due to some local injury at times or a lot of chronic long-standing infection. Yellow in a man with jaundice or if there's history of any drug intake. The pH is generally taken in the reference of 7.2 to 7.4. We routinely do not check for pH of the sperm or the semen. Now, liquefaction. This is the most important part of semen analysis because until and unless a semen liquefies or it actually becomes liquid, you do not test for the count and motility as it may give you false results. So immediately after ejaculation, when you see the semen sample, it is typically a semi-solid and a coagulated mass. And within a few minutes at room temperature, it starts to liquefy. That is because of the proteolytic enzymatic action of the prostate glands. Ideally, it should liquefy within 30 minutes. You may wait for 60 minutes for it to liquefy, but beyond 60 minutes, if it doesn't liquefy, then that goes to say that there is some problem with the prostatic secretions. So what are the various causes of delayed liquefaction? The delayed liquefaction can be because of any infection surgery of the prostate. And this can be found out if you just examine the patient and you would see a tender prostate. A simple treatment for this is giving antibiotics. But if on that day the semen sample is already in your lab and you want to do a therapeutic testing, or if you have to prepare that sample for IUI, what you can do is mix equal amount of semen with media and try mixing it for about 2 to 3 minutes. The semen sample liquefies. Second, continuous repeated gentle passage through the pipette. Just do in and out movement. That would be enough for the sample to be liquefied. The third thing is you could just add bromelain to that, 1 or 2 drops of semen sample, and it immediately liquefies. This can be used for doing semen testing if you have to do it in a non-liquefied sample. And if the patient has persistent history of delayed liquefaction, which can be idiopathic at times, what you can do is when you give a semen container to the patient to collect the sample, you could just put in some media inside and ask him to collect the sample in a container which already has media, so that as soon as the semen falls in the media, it starts liquefying after he shakes the sample. So he doesn't have to worry regarding the liquefaction. Now, another important factor of semen analysis is viscosity. Viscosity is nothing but allowing the semen to drop by gravity, and you could see that when it drops, it forms a long thread. So that thread should be around 2 centimeters in length. Anything more than that goes to show that the viscosity is abnormal. Viscosity is another important function which is given by prostatic gland secretions and 10 to 15% by seminal vesicles. So any infection, surgery of the prostate or the seminal vesicles reflects in delayed liquefaction and viscosity of the sample. Now, after this physical appearance and physical testing is done, we go for microscopy. We check for aggregation and agglutination. So these are two different terms. Aggregates are nothing but you would just see small semen sperm clumps in and around here and there. So whenever there is aggregation, you do not have to worry because they are just immotile sperms. You would see that the aggregates are not moving. So this is the most important thing to distinguish an aggregate from an agglutination. In agglutination, what happens is all your motile sperms start sticking to each other. Either they stick head to head or tail to tail or head to tail. If it is just an isolated finding, you need not worry about it. But if you see it in gross sample, that is more than 50 to 60% of the semen sample, wherein if you have identified high power fields there, and in almost all of the fields, you would see 1 or 2 agglutinates. So this is suggestive of anti-sperm antibodies. Initially, they used to do PCTs, but nowadays with the advent of immunological tests, they are not done. But still in few low resource setting, a PCT is always less financially burdening to the patient rather than these tests, the immunoglobulin test, which cost anything around 20 to 25,000. So whenever this agglutination is gross, it basically assesses a problem in counting the motility, because all the motile sperms have formed an agglutinate. And that is why the count may be wrongly assessed. Now coming to the motility, which is another important aspect of semen analysis, it is graded as progressive motility, non-progressive motility, and immotile sperms or immotility. So basically what happens in progressive motility is the sperm has got a forward progressive motility. It's nothing but a straight forward fast moving sperm is called as forward progressive motility, which should be more than 32%. And a non-progressive motility is when a sperm has motility, but instead of moving forward, it just starts making rounds around itself. It moves in circular manner, or it has got a very, very low motility wherein it cannot move beyond 1 or 2 fields. So when you do a total of progressive and non-progressive motility, so the combined motility should always be 40%. Many a times in the report, this motility is taken as grade A, B, C, D. Ideally, progressive motility should always start from grade A, but in multiple labs, it is the other way around also, where they take A as a non-motile sperm and D as progressive motility. But there are only 3 types of motility that you should always see in a semen sample. One is your progressive motility, second is non-progressive motility, and third is immotile sperms. Now the thing about immotile sperms is we have to distinguish whether these immotile sperms are dead sperms or they are live sperms, because immotility necessarily doesn't mean that they are dead. They are still sperms which may be live, but they have only a problem with their motility. Immotile sperms look like dead sperms because they're not moving. So that is why this concept of total motile sperm count came into being from 2015. So instead of just classifying the patient as oligospermia, asthenospermia, teratozoospermia, what we have started doing now, this is especially more useful for IVF, lesser useful for IUI. Number of moving sperm in the ejaculated are calculated by total motile sperm count, because you can prognosticate your results. You can basically divide the patients as to what treatment they have to be offered, whether they go directly for ICSI, whether you would do an IUI or an IVF. So total motile sperm count is nothing but multiply the volume of the semen sample into the sperm concentration per ml into the motility. Motility is nothing but your total of progressive and non-progressive motility, which has to be more than, progressive motility has to be more than 32%. So this TMSC, or the total motile sperm count, should be more than 20 million per ejaculate. So you can take that this sample is normal and the patient could even get pregnant on their own. If this TMSC is less than 5 million, so these patients are very good candidates for ICSI. That is, in ART instead of IVF, you can take them for ICSI and they'll give you good results. If this count is between 5 to 10 million, you could do an IVF for the patient. And if the count is anywhere between 10 to 20 million per ml, an IUI would suffice. And anything more than 20 is normal. So the total motile sperm count is nothing but multiplying volume into sperm concentration per ml into % motility. This is a very good article which came in 2015, and where they showed that this TMSC is a better indicator for the severity of male factor infertility than the WHO system of OATS, that is oligo-astheno-teratozoospermia. Because it is not wise to define men with semen parameters below reference as infertile, meaning that in the WHO criteria, wherein they have given anything less than the lower reference, cannot be taken as infertility, because pregnancy is not even guaranteed in couples where semen parameters are within or above the reference range. So as we all know that male age is inversely correlated with TMSC, the finding is consistent with several previous reports which affirm that male aging affects the fertility. Generally, the number of sperm cells as well as sperm motility decreases with age because it is accompanied by deterioration of testicular histological architecture as well. Now, here we need to differentiate immotile from dead sperms. So here comes the role for checking the vitality or the viability, where 58% is the normal value or the lower reference limit. Anything more than that is absolutely normal. This is done by a simple eosine staining. The principle behind this is the damaged plasma membrane of the dead sperm, which is a non-vital sperm, it allows entry of this impermeant stains. So the stain simply goes inside a dead sperm. So it is taken as dead sperms are always stained red. They look dark pink in your slide, but the dictum to be followed is dead sperms are always stained red. So we always have to ask the pathologist or whoever does the semen analysis to give a detailed report of this immotile sperm, because many a time in the motility, they just write as immotile sperms 50%, 60%. But we also have to ask him once, please check whether they are dead sperm or live sperm. Because if they are live sperm, the patient can still go for ART. But in case they are dead sperms, the treatment completely differs. Now coming to the number, there are two parameters which you check in the number. One is sperm concentration, that is sperm per ml. That is the number of spermatozoa per unit volume of semen, and it is nothing but a function of the number of spermatozoa emitted and the volume of fluid diluting them. The normal lower reference limit is 15 million per ml. Now the total sperm number is nothing but the total number of spermatozoa in the entire ejaculate. That is 39 million per ejaculate. Sperm concentration is nothing but the amount per ejaculate. Sorry, this is the total sperm number, and sperm concentration would always be per ml. So whenever you read any report, always see whether they have written it as sperm concentration or total sperm number. At times it happens that they write total sperm number as per ml and the values are given as low as 15 million. And you would think that it is lower than the reference limit, and suddenly the treatment of the patient changes. So sperm concentration is always per ml and total sperm number is of the total ejaculate or per ejaculate. Now round cells. This is another entity which we commonly find in all our reports. Round cells plus, pus cells many, or pus cells numerous, or pus cells more than 100, or pus cells incountable. So the thing is, round cells, macrophages and pus cells all look same under the slide. If you do a wet mount preparation and you look at the slide, everything appears round and all these three things appear to be the same. So you always have to cross check with whoever your pathologist or the reporting person is, have you done a peroxidase test for the pus cells? Because having pus cells suddenly changes your management to pyospermia and the patient is unnecessarily put for a semen culture analysis or a long course of antibiotics. Because generally what happens in pathology labs is under one single slide smear, all this is checked. So you basically have to do a dry smear peroxidase staining to see whether they are pus cells, because pus cells appear brown in peroxidase staining. But when you see all these in a wet preparation, all of them appear round. Even immature spermatids appear round and the patient is wrongly labeled as having pyospermia. And what happens is even after giving a lot of antibiotics, the patient again goes and checks in the same lab and again the same reports come. And macrophages, remember, is a normal finding in a semen sample. So you don't have to worry for the macrophages. Now coming to antibody testing, the anti-sperm antibodies in the semen are always IgG and IgA. They interfere with the acrosomal reaction and zona binding. There are two direct tests which are little costly and they have to be done only if you find any indication to test for anti-sperm antibodies. So when do you do that? When you find that the entire female factor for fertility are all right, everything for the male factor is also all right, but somehow the patient is not conceiving. So this could be a minor cause. This used to be done initially by the postcoital test, which now no longer is done in our settings, but still in places where these costly testing is not available, PCT is a good test to rule out anti-sperm antibodies. The mixed antiglobulin reaction is done in a native sample, but a more better test is the immunobead test, which costs anywhere between 20 to 25,000. It is done in a prepared sample. The simple principle is that the beads adhere to the motile and immotile spermatozoa that have surface bound antibodies, but the percentage of motile sperm with bound beads is recorded. So to do this immunobead test, the motility also has to be good because the beads which stick to the motile spermatozoa are only counted. So when the motility is good, it would give you a good test result. Now a word or a line about sperm DNA fragmentation. DNA fragmentation could be single or double stranded breaks in the nuclear DNA, which result in potential loss or alteration of genetic information. The sperm DNA breaks could be a result of defective spermatogenesis due to unrepaired DNA, which are generated during the process of chromatin remodeling. And the sperm DNA is organized in such a manner that it keeps the unclear chromatin compact and stable. So the main purpose of spermatozoa is delivery of the intact DNA, which contributes to the genetic information in the subsequent offspring. So there has been a lot of DNA fragmentation index tests going on. So we have to understand that this is a test which basically detects your single and double stranded breaks. So the difference between a single stranded break is that they can be corrected because they are just because of post-testicular exposure of the sample either to toxins, drugs, or environmental effects, and they can be corrected by your antioxidants. Now, which antioxidants to use, which would give you better results, there's still no clear-cut evidence, but that works only if they have single-stranded breaks. Now, double-stranded breaks are generally due to genetic defects in the patient, and these are not corrected with antioxidants. So there are n number of tests which are available which do this, but we have to understand that this DNA fragmentation index is not to be routinely done as your semen analysis report, because there is going to be some amount of DNA fragmentation always present because it's a wear and tear procedure. So even in a normal patient or even who has conceived, you would find some amount of DNA fragmentation index. So now in whom to do these tests? It basically is done in cases of recurrent implantation failure, in cases of IVF, recurrent IUI failures, if the patient has recurrent abortions, if the patient has failed IVF, in the sense you have done her IVF and the embryos have not developed or cleaved. So that is the time when you can think of doing a DFI for that patient. And you would find that if there is a very high DFI, so you could shift from IVF to ICSI. Or if you see that on repeated IVF attempts, you have embryo cleavage arrest. That is, the embryo has formed, but it is not dividing beyond the cleavage stage, that it doesn't divide into 6-cell, 8-cell, or a blastocyst stage. So that is the time that you can think of doing a DFI. It is a costly test. Plus, the other drawback is there is a lot of inter-test variation. There are about 5 to 6 types of DFI test available. So each lab does it by a different method. So we have to also understand that the values for DFI are also different for all these tests. So if you order a DFI, you also have to see what kind of a test is done, because their reference values are different and they are always given at the end of the test. A routine that is followed for all DFI is anything above 25 to 30%, the patient directly goes for ART. Anything less than 15% is taken as normal. And there are also a lot of inter-report variations. If suppose you have done a DFI for a patient today, and on the same patient you do a DFI after 1 month, you would find 2 different reports. The inter-test variations are also there, and inter-observer variations are also there, because now there are pre-stained slides where you can do DFI in your own lab. So if I do it, I will find some different DFI. If some other person does it on the same slide for the same patient, the result could differ. So we have to be very cautious when we order for a DFI, because we should be able to read the result. We should know which test or which method we are doing it, and what are you going to achieve by doing the DFI. Does the patient really need DFI? It is only to be done in very, very specific indications. Now, after all this is done, we come to semen preparation. As we all know that this is very important for all your IUI procedures. So it is always to be done in a laminar flow. The basic principles of labeling, collection, proper handling of the semen sample is to be done. You have to take specific consents before you go ahead with all this, and you have to treat it with universal precautions. A semen sample is biohazardous material. So there are 2 important techniques by which we generally prepare semen. One is the swim up technique and the other is density gradient. So density gradient is basically done when the count and motility are less, or when you have a sample which has a high amount of pus cells or debris, and wherein you think that doing a density gradient would give you better count and motility than a routine swim up technique. So in a routine swim up technique, you basically dilute semen and media in the proportion of 1:1. You can use any semen flushing media. You centrifuge this sample for 10 to 12 minutes at 1200 RPM in your REMI centrifuge. After this, you would get a supernatant and a sediment. You remove the supernatant and discard it. And whatever the pellet that you get, which is deposited at the end of your test tube or at the bottom of your test tube is the pellet. You again resuspend this supernatant with an equal amount of media which you had initially taken, which could be 1 ml for 1 ml of semen or 1.5 for 1.5 ml of semen. You recentrifuge it. You again would get a supernatant. You discard that supernatant. And above the pellet, you layer it with about 0.8 to 0.9 ml of media. Do not layer it with a huge amount of media thinking that I may need a lot of media for the IUI to flush the tubes. It wouldn't happen so. If you put an excess amount of semen sample inside the uterus, it's definitely going to come out because the capacity does not exceed anything more than 0.8 to 0.9. So this is for the swim up. And when you layer it with the media, you would actually see that there's a cloudy appearance over the media which you start getting, which is nothing but the sperm which has swimmed up and come. And this way, the count, whenever it is cloudy in appearance, it just goes to show that the count and motility are very good and it is a very good prepared sample. Now in this semen preparation, after you do an IUI, the patient should never experience any cramps or pain because in a badly prepared semen preparation, the patient would get pain and cramps if it contains debris or macrophages. So if the sample is not prepared well, the patient may experience pain and cramp. Now coming to the density gradient. Density gradient is nothing but centrifugation of seminal plasma over density gradients, which consist of colloidal silica coated with silane, which separates the cell by their density. A normal motile spermatozoa with an intact DNA has got a higher density and hence it goes down of the tube when you layer these density gradients in a test tube. The motile spermatozoa swims actively through the gradient material and it forms a soft pellet at the bottom of the tube. A density gradient is reverse of a swim up technique. Here the sperm swims down crossing the density gradients. We generally use a two-step discontinuous density gradient preparation. You get these density gradient media readily available in the market, either in the density of 40 and 80% or 45 and 90%. Here you layer the semen sample, the 80% density gradient forms the lowermost layer. Then you top it with 40% density gradient and then above it you top your semen sample. And then you centrifuge the sample in the same way as you do for a swim up technique. In density gradient, what happens is a very good motile sperm goes to the bottom of your tube and it forms a pillet. So this same pillet, after centrifugation, you just have to mix it with your media to the tune of 0.9 to 1 ml. Leave it in the warming test tube for about say 15-20 minutes and it is ready to use. This is a good technique for samples which have low count, low motility and wherein there is a lot of pus cells and debris. So sperm preparation using density gradient usually is there. It results in a highly motile spermatozoa free from debris, non-germ cells and degenerating germ cells. At times there may be immature sperm cells. So for them density gradient is a good media. Now coming to sperm preparation in HIV, as we all know that there are many cases where the couple is discordant, where the husband may be positive and the wife is negative and they want to go ahead and have a child by IUI. So we have to understand that no matter how you prepare the semen, wherein the density gradient is media, still cannot claim that that sample will be HIV free. Density gradient is followed by swim up. It has been proposed as a way of preventing this infection in uninfected female partners. The procedures were developed to separate the virus infected non-sperm cells and seminal plasma from HIV free motile spermatozoa in the swim up technique. Prepared samples are tested by RT-PCR and only HIV-free samples are used for ART treatments. In IUI, you can try doing this, but this does not give a 100% guarantee of the sample being HIV-free. While results so far are encouraging, there's yet insufficient evidence of the elimination of the risk of HIV infection through sperm preparation in this way. Thank you so much. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Ajni. A very nice lecture. Few questions are there. The first one is, do you label a semen sample is abnormal on a single testing, or we want to repeat it?
Generally, when a patient usually has a huge file of all the semen reports. So even if you see 2 or 3 reports of the patient in a year, that is enough. Only for azoospermia cases, it is always better to get a second sample done before you label the patient as azoospermic.
Okay. Usually 2 samples are required to label as abnormal
For
sample.
azoospermia, they should usually be at least 1.5 months apart.
Many questions comes regarding DFI, but you have already told in detail about DFI. One more question from Dr. Harshad sir. What is the role of varicocectomy, that is a treatment for varicocele in cases moderate asthenoteratozoospermia?
Okay. Thank you, sir, for the question. So now the recent guidelines have come where they say that a varicocele is only to be operated if it is palpable. That is why the importance of doing a detailed physical examination, because 30 to 40% of the time, if you send the patient directly for a scrotal USG, you would definitely find a varicocele, but that is a subclinical.
Ashwini.
Hello.
Ashwini.
Yes,
We
Milind.
are audible now. Can you repeat now?
Your video was lost.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I said only a palpable varicocele is to be treated in the modern times now. You do not have to touch a varicocele, which is a subclinical one or which is an accidental finding on your scrotal USG. Many a times you find many epididymal cysts also on the USG. So there is no need to touch or treat such cyst.
Great.
So one more question from Ashish. What is the role of TMC cutoff for IUI in Indian scenarios?
TMC cutoff. Generally, a
Okay.
cutoff of anything between 10 to 20 million is good to be treated by IUI in the Indian scenario, because we still follow the principle of doing 3 to 4 cycles of IUI. We do not directly take up the patient for IVF.
One more question from, hello. One
Hello?
more question. What is the concept of consequent pooling of semen sample?
Okay. Generally, it happens that when the abstinence period is very low, the semen sample that is collected is of low grade motility and count. So in such cases, we ask the patient for consecutive collection on the same day with a gap of 1 or 2 hours. It gives better semen sample. The pooled sample is good.
Okay. Is there any role of PCT nowadays?
I do not do PCT. I somehow never like that test. I still don't do it. Many andrologists advise the test these days because the immunological tests are costly. In low resource setting, to find out if there's any immunological cost, that is the only test which is available.
Okay.
Actually, there is one more question.
Yes, sir.
When to repeat the test in case if it is abnormal after giving medical treatment?
Any medical treatment should at least be given for 3 months, because that is what the sperm cycle is.
Exactly.
So any test should be repeated after a gap of 3 months. And any treatment that you want to give, whether it is antioxidants, give it at least for 3 months if you're giving it.
You should not repeat it before 3 months.
Before 3 months, yeah.
And if
Ashwini, I'm asking one question.
That is, if you have a 0% motility, then
Okay.
what will you do?
0% motility. Hello?
Ah.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yeah, when there is 0% motility, what should be done?
Okay.
What preparation you will do?
Okay, you just have to check, as I told you, whether that immotility is live or dead sperm.
Yeah.
If you have the same finding on a second sample also, which is done about 2 to 3 months later, you could give the patient carnitine in a period of 2 months. And if you still find that the semen sample is immotile but live sperm, you can take the patient for ART. And if the finding has changed to motile sperm, you can always go ahead with IUI.
Yeah.
Ashwini, if the samples for IUI more than 2, how will you follow the labeling of samples? What is your method of labeling samples?
The labeling should start with the collection itself. Whenever you give the container to the patient, always label it and then only keep it on the laminar, or then only accept it inside the lab. And the name should be written as a complete name. It should never be written as just the first name or the surname. It should be a complete name. I follow writing the middle name also, because many a times the surnames are repeated or the names are repeated.
So complete full name is there,
Yes.
and patient identification is important.
Yes.
Container name is very important.
Yes.
And one more question from Dr. Jitendra. What are recent lower normal limits of normal semen parameters according to recent WHO criteria? You already said about this.
I already explained.
This is 2010 fifth edition
WHO
criteria.
2010 manual, yeah.
Okay. And what is important, either motility or vitality?
Motility is important, sir, in IUI. And if you have to go in for ART procedures, even an immotile live sperm is fair enough to do an ART procedure.
And if liquefaction doesn't happen with the pipette up and down movement, then what will you do?
If the patient has persistent liquefaction problems, you could put in some media inside and then give the patient for collection and ask him to just shake it after he gives the sample. That solves the problem for liquefaction. Or you mix equal amount of media once it is in the lab and do up and down movement of pipetting. 100% times the problem of liquefaction is solved.
Is there any chemical solution or any material that will
You can
liquefy?
use bromelain, but it's generally not used by anybody nowadays. Initially, I used to use bromelain, but now this solves the purpose.
Actually,
So
there is
almost all questions are finished. Ashwini, very thank you much. Thank you. One more question.
Yes, Prakash, there is one more question. What should be done in cases where the husband is HbSAg positive?
You would treat the patient in the same way as you would do in a discordant couple. You have to tell them clearly that no matter how you prepare the sample, HbSAg is going to be transmitted. It is not 100% foolproof. And if the patient is still ready with that, you could go ahead and do the IUI in the same way as you would treat a seropositive patient. All universal precautions have to be taken.
There's one more question coming up, the success rate of IUI, but I think let Chaitanya.
Chaitanya will cover in his talk.
Yeah. Wonderful talk, Ashwini. Very, very nice.
Thank you so much, sir.
Great one. Great one.
Thank you very much, Ashwini. Very nicely talked.
Thank you, Prakash, sir.
Thank you, Ashwini. Very nice.
And now we move on to the other talk of today. Basics of IUI. Friends, we know infertility is on the rise in this 21st century, especially. And we have many factors for this, like advancing age at conception. We have metabolic disorders like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, a lot of stress. And while treating these infertile cases, IUI happens to be one of the steps in between the basic infertility treatment and the IVF. Though in other countries, especially European countries, the indications for IUI are decreasing, I feel it has got its own place, especially so in countries like India, where their economy also has to be considered while treating these IVF infertility patients. So we have the talk on basics of IUI today by our own Chaitanya Ganpule, who is the director of Yash IVF in center in Pune, and he is also the clinical secretary of POJS for this year 2020-21, doing wonderful work through this webinar, Connect the Experts, with Harshad and Ashwini, and I think we all have to congratulate them for doing wonderful work. Chaitanya is also the member of the endocrinology committee of FOXC, and he is an amazing endoscopic surgeon and infertility specialist. Over to you, Chaitanya, for your talk on basics of IUI.
Thank you, Milind sir, for that kind information. At the outset, good morning all, and I would like to thank Dr. Harshad sir and Dr. Ashwini for giving me this opportunity to be in front of you on the POJS platform. Well, NICE guidelines in 2013 said the couple suffering from unexplained infertility should go for IVF after 2 years of expectant management. This exclusion of IUI as an intermediate treatment is met mainly with disdain by fertility consultants all over the world, least some are practicing it. Now, there was a survey which was conducted in Britain itself, wherein 136 consultants from British Fertility Society were interviewed, out of which 16% agreed to the guideline which NICE had said. 30% of them opted not to change the practice of IUI, while 54% decided to wait for further evidence, which was published in 2014. So even if the NICE guideline had said that don't do IUIs, most of the consultants, even in Britain today, continue to offer IUI as one of the treatments. Therefore, IUI remains an important intermediate treatment for the patients before moving on to more complex treatments like IVF and ICSI. Well, optimization is the key to success. Optimization begins by knowing our basics well. If we know the basics well, we can improve the success rate of our IUI. The 4 pillars of basics is why I would be doing the IUI, for whom should I be doing the IUI, how do I do it, and when do I do it. So what is the rationale behind doing IUIs? It increases the gamete density at the site of fertilization even when the sperm or cervical mucus factors are present. It removes the cellular or cell-derived components other than the gametes like leukocytes, prostaglandins, or reactive oxygen species. It also removes the decapacitation factors which are present in the seminal fluid, and thus improving the success rate or chances of the couple achieving conception or pregnancy. Well, but if you have to increase our success rate, the most important factor is the patient selection. If the patient selection is good, obviously our success rate is going to be good. Therefore, what are the correct or right indications for doing IUI? The commonest indication for IUI is unexplained infertility. Now, when I say unexplained infertility, it is those couples wherein the tubal factor, the ovulatory factor, and the male factors are ruled out, and this couple has got less than 30% chance of conceiving naturally within a span of 1 year. Then anovulatory infertility or PCOS, in which just ovarian stimulation or ovulation induction has failed to achieve pregnancy, that is another indication for doing IUI. Well, mild male factor infertility. Now, when you say mild male factor infertility, how do you define mild male factor infertility? Anything with a total motile sperm count of more than 10 million is supposed to be normal. Anything between 3 and 10 million is taken as mild male factor infertility. And these are these couples wherein doing IUI is going to help. And then finally, the cervical factor infertility. But friends, because most of us have stopped doing postcoital test, as Ashwini said, really cervical factor infertility is diagnosed to that extent, and whether it remains to be an indication for IUI is a question mark. When I say less than 30% chance of spontaneous conception in a couple, how do I come to that percentage? There are many different prediction models which are present, but out of which UNO, which was published in 2004, is the one which is most validated externally as well as internally. Now, it takes into account the age of the patient, the duration of infertility, whether she is having primary infertility or secondary infertility, what is the referral status of the patient, whether she is referred by a general practitioner or whether she is referred by a gynecologist. This tells us to what extent the treatment has been done with that particular patient, and then the postcoital test. And here you can see that there were 2 models which were validated, one with 3 sample and 2 sample. In 3 sample, the PCT was not taken as an predictor, and in 2 sample, the PCT was taken as an predictor. So there is a prognostic index score which we come to, and from that we can predict what is the possibility or probability of the couple getting conceived naturally, spontaneously within an year's time. All those who have got a success rate of less than 30%, prediction of less than 30%, should go for IUI. Alexandra Bensdorp has revised this in 2017 because the way we look at infertile couples has changed over a period of time. So she introduced FSH levels into it, the BMI of the patient into it, and the pregnancy history. And you can see here that the postcoital test was taken away from it and a new score was devised. And this new score can be used for all our infertile couples to know what is the chance of natural conception in this particular couple. And if it is less than 30%, go for IUIs. once we decide to go for IUI, the next common question which comes in our mind is, okay, fine, I have decided to go for IUI. How do I induce this patient? What are the ovulation induction options do I have in front of me? The drugs which are used for ovulation induction are anti-estrogens like clomiphene citrate and tamoxifen, or aromatase inhibitors like letrozole or anastrozole, or we can use gonadotropins like HMG, HMG-HP, urinary FSH, or recombinant FSH. Let's discuss something about clomiphene and letrozole. The most important difference between the two which we should remember is that one leads to multifollicular development while the another leads to monofollicular development. The clomiphene citrate is a centrally acting drug, so it attaches itself to the estrogen receptors at the hypothalamus level and increases the secretion of FSH. Now, as the follicle starts growing, the estrogen levels will increase, but because the negative feedback is blocked, it will not decrease the secretion of FSH, and therefore this FSH window is widened. And because of this widened FSH window, there is multifollicular development in case of clomiphene citrate. As against letrozole is a peripherally active drug, therefore it acts in the ovary and reduces the conversion of androgens to estrogen. Now, as the FSH level starts rising, the follicle starts developing, the estrogen levels rise, and because the negative feedback mechanism is intact, it reduces the secretion of FSH and therefore leading to a monofollicular development. This is one of the important differences between clomiphene citrate and letrozole which we should keep in mind. Now, what are the different protocols of clomiphene citrate which we can use? The commonest used is the standard protocol in which we start with clomiphene citrate 50 milligrams once a day. You can start anytime between day 2 or day 5. There is no difference if you start on day 2 or that you start on day 5, and is given for 5 days. And then we start with the ultrasound monitoring from the 10th day onwards. Now, if the patient doesn't respond to 50 milligrams in this cycle, we increase the dose to 100 milligrams and 150 milligrams at the most in the subsequent cycles. Now, this is the standard protocol. Now, if patient doesn't respond to standard protocol, we can use something called as an extended protocol. In this, what we do is we give clomiphene citrate 100 milligrams from day 2 or day 3 continuously for 10 days. It was proposed by Fluker in 1996. Now, what it does is it again widens the FSH window by occupying the estrogen receptors for a longer time, and therefore the FSH is increased, and therefore there is follicular development. So those who don't respond to standard protocol can be given extended protocol. There is something called as an stair-step protocol. Now, what we normally do if a patient doesn't respond to standard protocol is we give her progesterone for the withdrawal bleed, and then we increase the dose in the subsequent cycle. But there are certain papers which have said that if we are using progesterone as a pre-treatment in clomiphene citrate cycles, then it reduces the ovulation rate as well as the pregnancy rates. And therefore, Hurst in 2009 proposed this stair-step protocol in which we give CC from day 2, day 3 for 5 days. Then we do ultrasound 4 to 5 days after the last pill. If there is no growing follicle more than 10 millimeters, we increase the dose and again start her on clomiphene for next 5 days. We do the ultrasound the next day after stopping the pills. If the follicle is still less than 10 millimeters, increase the dose to 150. Everything is done in the same cycle. Now, this also what it gives us is that it reduces the time to conception by doing this stair-step protocol. Whatever protocol you use, the overall results with clomiphene citrate is that we get an ovulation rate of about 70 to 90%, but the pregnancy rates hover about 30 to 40%. Now, this is because mostly of the anti-estrogenic actions of the clomiphene citrate, which are seen on the endometrium. Therefore, a novel protocol was proposed by Ahmed Badawi, luteal phase start protocol, in which we give patients medroxyprogesterone acetate for 10 days from day 15 to day 25, the previous cycle, and then start with clomiphene citrate immediately after you stop with the medroxyprogesterone acetate for 5 days. So this becomes a luteal phase start for the clomiphene citrate. The idea is, because you are giving it at an earlier stage, the clomiphene will not, the action will not continue for a longer time in the luteal phase of the next cycle, and therefore it reduces the anti-estrogenic actions on the endometrium. In spite of all this, we come to a situation wherein we have got clomiphene resistance, wherein there is failure of ovulation even after 3 cycles of maximum dose. Or CC failures, failure to conceive at the end of 6 cycles. What do I do in such cases? Well, introspect, go back to your drawing table and see what's happening. What is the age of the patient? Am I giving induction to a woman who is not supposed to be given an induction? What is the BMI? Am I dealing with an obese patient? What is the AMH? Is the AMH normal? It's low or high? And look for other hormonal profiles and correct whatever is to be corrected. Now, if you see, there is an impact of body mass index and AMH on the clinical pregnancy rates with clomiphene citrate and IUI. If you see that the pregnancy rates are maximum when the AMH is normal and the BMI is between 19 and 30. What are the different protocols for letrozole? Again, a standard protocol which is used mostly for PCOS, unexplained infertility and CC resistance. We start with 2.5 milligrams of letrozole from day 2 to day 5 any day, and then given it for 5 days. If the patient doesn't respond in the first cycle, increase the dose of letrozole to 5 milligrams in the next cycle up to 7.5 milligrams. If the patient doesn't respond to your standard protocol, we can use something called as an extended protocol, wherein letrozole 2.5 milligrams is started from day 1 of the cycle and given for 10 days. Now here again, the concept is that because you are giving letrozole for a longer period of time, you are maintaining the hypoestrogenic condition for a longer period of time, and that widens the FSH window and leading to follicular development and ovulation. Different protocol, step-up protocol was proposed by Mitwali. Now here what we do is we start with letrozole 2.5 milligrams on day 2, increase the dose to 5 on day 3, 7.5 on day 4 and 10 on day 5. Here again, because of the increasing estrogen levels, there would be a negative feedback which will reduce the FSH levels. Therefore, what I do is, as the estrogen levels start increasing, I increase the dose of letrozole, and because I am increasing the dose of letrozole, the estrogen levels will remain normal and therefore are hypoestrogenic, and that will increase again the FSH secretion, and that's how I can achieve more follicular development in these patients. That is what is achieved by doing a step-up protocol. To avoid multiple dosing, this single dose protocol was devised, in which instead of giving 12.5 milligrams of letrozole over a period of 5 days, a single 20 milligrams of letrozole was given on day 3 and by Mitwali and Casper, and he achieved equal ovulation rates as well as pregnancy rates and live birth rates with a single dose protocol also. Well, stair-step protocol, it's more or less similar to what is done in clomiphene citrate. Again, it is used to reduce the time for conception, number 1, and number 2, avoid the deleterious effects of progesterone pre-treatment on the letrozole cycle. So this was proposed again by Thomas in 2019. Well, still, some patients may have something called as an letrozole resistance, wherein there is no ovulation after 3 cycles of increasing the dose up to 7.5 milligrams. Now here we have a situation, a patient who is resistant to clomiphene citrate. That's the reason why we shifted her to letrozole. Now she is also resistant to letrozole. She is not ovulating even on letrozole. What should I be doing? I have one option of going on to gonadotropins, or there is one more novel protocol which has been proposed, in which we give a combination of letrozole and clomiphene citrate to the patient. Letrozole 2.5 milligrams and clomiphene citrate 50 milligrams per day are started from day 2 or day 3 and given for 5 days. Now this was a paper which was published in 2019, and the primary outcome of this study was ovulation defined by mid-luteal progesterone levels. And if you can see here, the letrozole and CC group showed much better ovulation rates and much better conception rates as compared to letrozole alone. And therefore, this can be used for women who are resistant to both clomiphene as well as letrozole. Well, I know now letrozole is also working, clomiphene citrate is also working. So should I be using clomiphene citrate or should I be using letrozole? Or should I be using different for different indications? Well, this was a study which was a landmark study which was published by Richard Legros in 2014. About 750 patients were randomized. This is the largest study till date. And in this randomization, what they did, the PCOS patients were randomized to taking letrozole or clomiphene citrate. and then the ovulation rate, conception rates were compared. If you see here, the live births, the conception rate, the ovulation rate, and the conception to ovulation rates were much higher in the letrozole group as compared to the clomiphene citrate group. Now, if you see the one more point which came out of this study was that the conception to ovulation rate was more or less similar for both CC as well as letrozole, but the ovulation to pregnancy rate was much higher for letrozole as compared to clomiphene citrate. There were some drawbacks as well, that more than 2/3 of the patients had BMI which was more than 30. So most of the patients were obese in this class, but no lifestyle modifications were advised in this case, or the withdrawal bleed was left with the investigators. So there was no protocol as such for the withdrawal bleed. Some were given, some were not, and there was a high dropout rate of 20%. Another study which was published in 2017, 159 patients were randomized, and the primary outcome was a pregnancy rate. Here the women had a BMI of less than 35%. Here also you can see the pregnancy rates are much better for letrozole, 61% versus 43%. Even live birth rate is statistically significant for letrozole. Pregnancies per ovulating patients are also more in letrozole and statistically significant. And therefore, this was again a study here, because the BMI was less than 35, it may not be applicable to women who are obese. A 2018 Cochrane database which studied 8 who compared letrozole and Cochrane again said letrozole appears to improve live birth and pregnancy rates in subfertile women with anovulatory PCOS compared to clomiphene citrate. Again, PCOS, letrozole is better drug than clomiphene citrate. It could be attributed to the low levels of estrogen and high levels of progesterone seen in the mid-luteal phase as compared to CC, probably due to sustained aromatase inhibition in the luteal phase. So we have come to a conclusion that letrozole is better than CC when we are treating patients with PCOS. In patients of unexplained infertility and in patients of male factor infertility, letrozole and CC both have shown to have equal results, and therefore you can choose any of the drugs to use in these indications. What is the role of gonadotropins in ovulation induction when we are doing IUI? Well, this was a study which was published in 2012 by Roy Homburg. Clomiphene citrate was compared with low dose FSH as the first line of treatment in women with polycystic ovaries and IUI. You can see the clinical pregnancy rates were better with FSH, 58%, as compared to clomiphene citrate, 44%. And ongoing pregnancy rates were also good with FSH as compared to clomiphene citrate. There were 2 Cochrane reviews which were published in 2016 and 2019. Both of them showed that gonadotropins are better than clomiphene citrate as far as the live birth rates are concerned. The recent guidelines, this is for PCOS, but the recent guideline, which is published by ASRM in March 2020, suggests that use of low dose or conventional dose gonadotropins with IUI is not recommended. And the reason behind this is that it also simultaneously increases the multiple gestation pregnancy rates. But here also, gonadotropins with IUI has given us better results as compared to oral ovulations, but it has also increased the multiple gestation pregnancy rates, and therefore they have suggested maybe for unexplained infertility, we should not be using gonadotropins with IUI. Oral ovulations with IUI should be sufficient. If not, shift on to IVF with single embryo transfer. What are the different protocols which we can use in gonadotropins? With gonadotropins, a conventional protocol in which we start with 75 international units of RFSH, urinary FSH or HMG. All the gonadotropins have found to be equally effective. So there is nothing like I will choose RFSH or I will choose HMG. You can choose whatever you want as per the patient's paying capacity. And then start it from day 3 or day 4, give it for 5-6 days, do the ultrasound. If there is no development of the follicle, increase the dose from 75 to 150. This is the conventional protocol. Now there is a low dose protocol in which we start with 75 international units of RFSH, urinary FSH or HMG. If there is no follicular development, I increase the dose by 37.5 instead of 75, and that's how the low dose protocol continues. Give it for 6 days, again increase by 37.5 if no response. Professor Roy Hamburg proposed this chronic low dose protocol, especially for women with PCOS. He started with a dose of 50 international units of FSH or recombinant FSH, given for 7 days in a row. Do an ultrasound. If there is no growth of the follicle, increase the dose by 25 international units to 75, again give for 7 days, see the ultrasound, increase again by 25, and this goes on till you get 1 or 2 follicular development. So this is a chronic low dose protocol. So 3 protocols: conventional, low dose, and chronic low dose protocol. Chronic low dose is especially important or in cases of PCOS. Well, many of us even today are giving alternate day gonadotropins. So what we do is we start gonadotropins from day 5, day 7, day 9, and day 11. Is it really helping us in giving results to our patient? This was a paper which was published in 2009 comparing daily and alternate day recombinant FSH stimulation protocols for intrauterine inseminations. And you can see here clearly the daily injections, we had a pregnancy rate of 42%, while in alternate day injections, we had a clinical pregnancy rate of 19%. And so statistically, it was better to give daily injections. Now, the rationale behind is the bioequivalence of FSH injection. If you can see here, the levels of FSH in the blood rise or peak at around 24 hours, and then they go down by 48 hours. So if we are giving it alternate day, there is an erratic up and down levels of the FSH, and that is deleterious to the developing follicle. And therefore, if we decide to give gonadotropins, it should be on a daily basis rather than an alternate day basis. Now, once the follicle is developed, the HCG trigger, when to give the HCG trigger? Now, one thing I would like to tell all of us, that whosoever is thinking of or are doing IUI, all the scans should be done by themselves. It should be a transvaginal scan. We won't send the patients to a sonologist. We would be doing the scans for ourselves, and the HCG trigger will be given whenever the follicle size is more than 18 millimeters, when 3/4 of the follicle shows an vascularity, when the perifollicular blood flow shows that the peak systolic velocity is more than 10, and the resistance index is between 0.42 and 0.48. It's not only the perifollicular blood flow which I would be looking at. We should also be looking at the endometrium. The endometrium should be at least 8 millimeters or more. Though there are certain studies which have said in IUI, the endometrial thickness will not matter much as compared to the IVF cycles, but still we take it 7 millimeters or 8 millimeters. It should be 999, grade A, and the uterine artery PI on the side of where the ovulation is going to happen should be less than 3.2. Now, when all these criteria are met, that's the time when I would be giving the trigger. We can give trigger with any 5,000, 10,000 of urinary HCG or recombinant HCG. The results are the same. The results doesn't change. Well, I've given the HCG trigger. Now, when do I do the IUI? Should I do it at 24 hours post IUI trigger? Should I be doing at 36 hours? Should I be doing at 42 hours or 48 hours? There are some studies which are published on this. This was a study which was published 36 hours, 42 hours, and 48 hours. And it seemed that if the IUI is done 42 hours after the trigger, the chances of success are the maximum. There are certain papers which have compared 24 hours with 36 hours. And in that they have shown 36 hours to be better. But 42 hours seems to be the best of all whatever has been compared till date. Should I be doing double IUI or should I be doing single IUI? Well, there are studies which have been published on doing whether we should be doing double IUI or single IUI. Here you can see that this was a study which was published in 2010, and the pregnancy rate per cycle was not different between group A and group B, where double IUI was done or single IUI was done. Similarly, a meta-analysis which was published in 2010 by Polizos also said, in fact, it showed that the single IUI had better results than the double IUI. So as far as unexplained infertility or PCOS is concerned, single IUI is more than sufficient. There is no need to do a double IUI. There is no supporting evidence to do double IUI, which will increase the pregnancy rates. But there are certain papers in cases of male factor infertility, where they have found that the patients with a diagnosis of male factor infertility may benefit from double IUIs, but still further studies with larger numbers are necessary. Now, there was a meta-analysis and systematic review which was published in 2013, which considered 5 RCTs, and they showed that when the couple has got male factor infertility, double IUI may help to increase the pregnancy rates. Therefore, double IUI may be of a choice when we are dealing with a male factor infertility, but for unexplained infertility or PCOS, single IUI is more than enough. Should I be giving rest to my patients after doing the IUI? There are 3 papers which have been published till date by Saleh in 2000, Custers in 2009, and 2017 recently by Rizwick, out of which 2 favors 10 to 15 minutes of rest after IUI that has shown to improve the pregnancy rates, while one of them has got no difference in the pregnancy rates with the rest. So maybe with 2 studies in favor of rest, we can think of giving a rest of about 10 to 15 minutes post IUI to the patient. For how many cycles should I be doing the IUI? Should I do IUI 1 time? Should I be doing it 4 times? We do get patients referred to us who have done 10 cycles, 15 cycles, 20 cycles of IUI. What is the rationale behind doing so many cycles of IUI? Well, if we search the literature, it shows that the cumulative pregnancy rate flattens after 4 cycles of IUI. This was a paper published in 2004. Here you can see the rate is flattened after 4 cycles of IUI. Now, there is one more paper which was published in 2013, this was a beautiful paper because this also considered the age of the patient in addition to the number of inseminations done. And here you can see, irrespective, all for the women who are less than 25 years, that was the only time when it peaked at the second IUI cycle. For all rest age groups, it peaked after 3 or 4 cycles of IUI. Therefore, as far as the number of IUI cycles to be done, maybe 3 or 4 is sufficient. More than that is not needed. It plateaus, it flattens, there is no need. Therefore, after 4 cycles, if she doesn't respond, switch on to the next line of management. Should I be giving luteal phase support in IUI? Now, the basic rationale behind giving luteal phase support in IVF cycle is that we are using agonist or antagonist, and therefore the gonadotropin secretion from the pituitary is negated, is 0, even in the luteal phase, and therefore there is a need for the corpus luteum to be sustained. For FSH and LH is needed for this corpus luteum to be sustained, and therefore, because the agonist and antagonist are there used in IVF cycles, the corpus luteum cannot sustain for long, and that's the reason why we should be supplementing progesterone in the luteal phase in IVF cycles. Is it true when we are using clomiphene citrate or letrozole? No, we are not reducing the FSH and LH secretion from the pituitary, and therefore, if you see the studies which have been published of luteal phase support in oral ovulations show no difference in the pregnancy rate. No progesterone group as well as progesterone group both has got the same pregnancy rates. Therefore, luteal phase support is not needed when you are using oral ovulations for IUI. This was a meta-analysis which was published by Hill, progesterone luteal support after ovulation induction and intrauterine insemination. Now, he took into consideration 3 different scenarios when we are using gonadotropins, when we are using only clomiphene citrate, and when we are using a combination of clomiphene citrate and gonadotropins. You can clearly see that supplementing progesterone was helpful in increasing the pregnancy rates when gonadotropins were used because of the reasons I already mentioned. In cases of clomiphene citrate, there was no need of progesterone supplementation. Even when we were using a combination of clomiphene and gonadotropins, supplementing progesterone in the luteal phase improved the pregnancy rates, and therefore luteal phase support should be given only in cases where you are using gonadotropins for stimulation. If you are using oral ovulations, there is no need to give a luteal phase support. Now, the basics of IUI will not be completed if I don't discuss something about complications and where not to do or where to avoid the IUI. Complications, the commonest complication which we see or which we get is pelvic pain. That is because of the faulty preparation of the semen, which Ashwini has already talked about. If we are doing repeated or recurrent IUIs in patients with pelvic abscesses, with endometriosis or endometriotic cysts, there is a possibility that we may land up in pelvic abscesses. So that should be avoided. Obviously, multi-patent gestation is one of the complications which has to be looked into when we are doing IUIs. It should not happen that we are increasing the pregnancy rates, but at the same time we are increasing the multi-fetal gestations, because it gives increase to perinatal mortality and morbidity. And the last but not the least, oral ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. It is much less commonly seen in patients with IUI as compared to IVF, but still it remains a reality and should be looked into when we are monitoring the patients. Which are the conditions or which are the situations wherein we should avoid IUI? Well, where the total motile sperm count is less than 3 million, avoid doing IUIs. Those patients are not going to be benefited by doing IUI. Straight away ask them to go for IVF. In grade 3, grade 4 endometriosis or in an operated endometrioma, the tubo-ovarian relationship is not maintained. So the chances of conception with IUI are going to be less. So these women should be asked to go for IVF ICSI rather than going for IUI. Low AMH patients, don't spend time, don't waste time of the patient as well as yours in doing IUI. These are the patients which are candidates for IVF. Single patent tube with low AMH or endometriosis, again, no IUIs. Adenomyosis, it has been shown that adenomyosis reduces the chances of conception with IUI. Maybe we can help this as a stepping stone before counseling the patient for IVF. In a woman who is more than 40 years of age, again, avoid IUI, except for the situations wherein we know that she is a patient of PCOS, she has got a good ovarian reserve, she has at least 5 follicles per ovary. These are the women who may, go for a few cycles of IUI. Otherwise, any woman who is more than 40 years of age should be going for IVF straight away without IUIs. So to summarize, the patient selection is the key to success. UNO scoring system could be of help to identifying the patients in whom I should be offering IUI. CC letrozole are equally effective in unexplained and mild male factor infertility. Letrozole is preferred over CC in cases of PCOS. Gonadotropins improve the chances of pregnancy and live birth rates in PCOS. Its use in women with unexplained or male factor needs reconsideration because of that one report which has come lately. Chronic low dose protocol should be preferred over conventional protocol in women with PCOS. Ultrasound features should be used to time the trigger. 42 hours seems to be the most effective time of insemination post HCG trigger. Single IUI is enough except for male factor infertility, wherein double IUI may help. Cumulative pregnancy rate flattens after 4 cycles, and therefore that should be the cutoff beyond which we should not be doing IUIs. Luteal phase support is needed only if gonadotropins are used for ovulation induction. Thank you so much for the patient hearing.
Wonderful talk, Chaitanya.
Thank you, sir.
Took us through all the basics of IUI. There are a few questions for you. One is about the role of sildenafil with clomiphene citrate while doing IUI.
Sildenafil, okay. Sildenafil is a drug which is used to improve the vascularity of the endometrium, and see, if it is because of the clomiphene citrate that you have there is reduced vascularity of the endometrium, it is not going to help, because finally it's through the estrogen which the vascularity increases of the endometrium, and therefore it is not going to be of much help in these patients.
Okay, what do you practically do for thin endometrium?
Basically, we need to understand why this thin endometrium is. Is it because of the endo organ problem with the endometrium, or is it because of the quality of the oocyte? Less estrogen and therefore less of endometrium. If less estrogen and therefore less endometrium, maybe we can help, or we can think of giving something to improve the quality of the egg. There are certain adjuvants which are there which may improve the quality of the egg. But if it's an end organ, there are certain things which can be used, like GCSF can be used, PRP or platelet-rich plasma which can be used. Giving estrogen supplement in these women, I don't think it's going to help if it's an end organ failure.
Okay.
Chaitanya.
Role of other adjuvants like myo-inositol or metformin. What is your take on it?
Myo-inositol is helpful in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome. What myo-inositol basically does is it reduces the insulin resistance and increases the insulin sensitivity. So what happens is it normalizes the progesterone levels, it normalizes the estrogen levels, it decreases the LH levels and helps to normalize the FSH-LH ratio. And that is the reason why myo-inositol could be of help in women who have got PCOS.
Practically, Chaitanya, what do you do in your own practice? Do you give oral ovulations or you directly go ahead with the gonadotropins? I'm not talking about male infertility, for the female factors.
I prefer to do, see, most of the times when the patients come to me, they are already taken oral ovulations somewhere. And therefore, I prefer to start with gonadotropins and then do IUI. Now, the latest, as I said, the latest study which have come up in 2020, that's the one which says, but what they have said is that it increases the multi-fetal gestation. Now, we have to decide whether we want, increased birth rate, increased pregnancy rates, at the cost of increasing the multi-fetal gestation. That's one thing what we need to decide for ourselves and do it.
I think we need to weigh these things.
Chaitanya, a few more questions are there. If bleeding starts after IUI, then what will you do?
See, there is nothing which you can do. When you are doing IUI, you have to take precaution that you are not touching the endometrium somewhere. If there is a bleeding, it's going to reduce our success rate for sure. You cannot do anything. So one thing which you can do is you can do the IUI under ultrasound guidance. Just go beyond the internal os and then deposit the semen sample there.
Okay. One more question is there, role of IUI in low ovarian reserve patient.
I didn't get it. Can you just repeat?
Role of IUI in low ovarian reserve.
Low ovarian reserve patients. Ideally, low ovarian reserve patients should go for IVF, but there are certain protocols which are used even for IVF, minimal stimulation protocols in IVF, like you give clomiphene citrate and then maybe alternate day. That's what they have proposed of giving gonadotropins, even though I said that it's of no use, but there are certain protocols which use this. Now, the same protocols you can use even for IUI. Now, if finally the chances of conception are going to be very low, or you are going to develop 1 or 2 follicle, maybe in such patients, instead of going for IVF, if they are not ready for donor eggs, IUI would be an option.
And which is the better trigger, 5,000 or 10,000?
Even 2,500 has shown to increase the, shown to give us ovulation. Therefore, there is nothing like 5,000 or 10,000. You can use any.
Preferred.
What is your take on using Ovitrel for trigger?
There are papers which have said there is no difference in the ovulation rate and pregnancy rates, even if you are using urinary HCG or you are using recombinant HCG. So there is no difference which it is.
And is there any difference between trigger in clomiphene citrate cycle and gonadotropin cycle?
Yes, gonadotropin cycles, we have to give what they say is because they are not following the ultrasound protocol. So there, what happens is in gonadotropin stimulated cycle, we give a trigger at an early stage, say 17, 18 millimeters, while in oral ovulations, we usually wait for 19 or 20 millimeters of the size before giving the trigger. But then see, if you are following the ultrasound criteria for giving the triggers, it doesn't matter how big is the follicle.
Okay. And one more question is there. What is BN Chakrabarty protocol?
I need to look in. I need to look for this.
Okay. And what is the effect of long FSH window?
The long FSH, the longer the FSH window, it will be. It's like, you know, you are increasing the FSH secretion for a longer period of time. So instead of 2 days, if it becomes 4 days or 5 days, the possibility of follicular development is more, or maybe multifollicular development is also more.
Okay. Is there any indication for addition of antagonist?
Good question. There is a role of antagonist when we are dealing with patients of PCOS, because there is premature luteinization of the follicle in these women. Therefore, if you have a patient in whom you have got a previous luteinized unruptured follicle, or measures which can tell me that yes, premature luteinization has happened in this case, can be given antagonists. But maybe for beginners, what we can do is, to begin with, till you get the hang of it, give antagonists for all the patients of PCOS. And then once you know when and how to give it, then you can stop giving it for all the patients, and then individualize it.
And in cases of PCOS, how will you assess and decide which protocol to be started?
It depends upon AMH.
Okay.
It depends upon how severe is the dense is the ovarian stroma. Because severe is the polycystic ovaries, possibility that it needs a higher level for threshold, and therefore a little high level of gonadotropins are needed in these patients. But then, if you cross the threshold, there is a possibility that the patient may land up in OHSS. That's exactly the reason why Professor Homburg says that you start with low dose protocol, and sometime or the other that threshold will be reached. Once that threshold is reached, you will start getting the follicular development. The only thing is that you have to wait patiently for a long period of time. That's all.
Chaitanya, there are 2-3 things about thin endometrium. If you want to give GCSF or PRP, then how do we do it, and what is the dose, and when do we do it?
Okay. See, there is a beautiful paper. I cannot show it. There is a beautiful paper which is studied the endometrium in IUI and endometrium in IVF. So what they found is, in IUI, the thinning of the endometrium has got nothing to do with the pregnancy rates. Even if the endometrium was 7 millimeters, the pregnancy rates were the same in IUI as compared to IVF. So if I get a thin endometrium, should I go ahead with the IUI or should I cancel the cycle? The papers say that no, you go ahead with the cycle. Don't cancel the IUI cycle because the endometrium is thin. As against IVF, we say that if there is a thin endometrium, don't transfer in the same cycle, freeze all the embryos, and then see why the endometrium is not developed.
One more question from Dr. Priti Upadhyay. You already told about PCOS. She has a case of high AMH, that is more than 12, with BMI 30. What should be starting dose of gonadotropin in case of PCOS, FSH and HMG?
See, PCOS always I prefer to go by chronic low dose. So I start with 50 international units and then increase it every week.
Okay. And one more question from Milind. Pregnancy rates after daily gonadotropin versus sequential gonadotropin.
Sequential means alternate day, you are saying?
Yeah, alternate days.
See, with sequential, it is almost around 15 to 16%, while that was the study which I showed you. And with a daily dose of gonadotropins, it was around 35 to 40%. So there's a big difference between the two. But see, this is only one study which has been published, and that too, the number of participants in the daily gonadotropin were only 28, as compared to alternate day there were almost 200 or something, 178 or something. So there's a disparity in the number of participants. So we might need to have a larger study. But if you go by the bioequivalence of FSH, giving alternate day doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Chaitanya, for the thin endometrium, if you need to, do you do endometrial scratching? And if you are doing, then how do you plan it? When do you do it?
The endometrial scratching came up in a big way, but the most recent Cochrane analysis of endometrial scratching for thin endometrium has said that there is no role of endometrial scratching in improving the success rate.
Okay.
One more question is there. If you do the IUI in post follicle rupture, is the pregnancy rate change?
Okay, good question. It is said that the sperms should be present at the time of ovulation in the system.
Okay.
Therefore, all women who have got post-ovulatory IUI done, all the literature says that the success rate is 0%. Almost 0%. So if you already, if already the ovulation has occurred, no point in doing IUI.
Okay.
If at all PRP is to be used, then how do we do it and when do we do it?
I am not doing PRP for my IUI patients. I am doing it for my IVF patients, in which I do it after 5 days of estrogen therapy, down-regulated cycle, estrogen therapy for 5 days, do PRP, see endometrium after 48 hours. If there is an improvement in the endometrium, then don't repeat it. If there is no change in the endometrium, we can repeat it after even 48 hours.
What is the dose?
You cannot insert more than 0.5, because the cavity, the volume of the cavity in an collapsed uterus is not more than 0.5.
It's like IUI only.
Yeah, it's like IUI.
And if at all you have a difficulty in doing IUI, you cannot negotiate, then what is your plan? Do you hold the cervix? How do you manage it?
Yes, I mean, at that particular moment of time, we have to hold the cervix. But holding of cervix is going to release prostaglandins.
Yeah.
And that release of prostaglandins is going to reduce your success rate. So maybe dummy, as you do a dummy transfer or a mock transfer before IVF, we can think of doing a mock IUI before we actually start with the IUI cycle.
And I think doing it under ultrasound guidance probably might help us.
Yes. We are doing all our IUIs under ultrasound guidance.
Yes, yes.
No IUI without ultrasound guidance.
And there's one more question, that if at all we are doing double insemination, then what is the timing of the first IUI?
12 hours and then 36 hours.
12 and 36
hours. Chaitanya, one more question is there. On post IUI day 1, patient develop pelvic pains,
yes,
pelvic cramps.
Yes.
Will it affect of conception?
The conception, see, basically the pelvic pain is because of the uterine cramp.
Post IUI day 1.
Contractility increases because of the release of the prostaglandin.
Not immediately. And day
Even
1.
after that, yes, even the next day, if it is because of the uterine contractility basically. So it is going to reduce the chances of conception.
Is there any different analgesic to be used?
No, Buscopan or Hyoscine is sufficient.
Okay.
There was a question on IUI in low ovarian reserve. Then I think you have told that in low ovarian reserve we should not be doing IUI. So that I think is answered. And one more question is about, there are certain companies marketing 7,500 IU of HCG. Have you ever used it? What is your experience?
What is the question?
There are
7,500
using 7,500 IU of HCG.
Yes.
What is your take on it?
As I said, 5,000, 10,000, they give equal results. So in between 7,500, I have not used it personally, but it's going to give the same results.
The logic behind that injection probably is 250 IU of microma for Vitrel amounts to 6,500 IU of HCG.
6,500 of HCG. Yes.
That is probably the reason why they have prepared that 7,500.
Maybe yes.
So maybe 5,000 or 10,000 probably give same results. So whatever you are comfortable with, you can use it.
Absolutely.
Wonderful talk, Chaitanya, and wonderful discussion also. There were so many questions and you have probably answered everything. So I
think
first of all would like to thank QoGS for giving us an opportunity to chair this important session and with the two dear friends. And so Harshad and Ashwini, congratulations for this wonderful concept of connect with the experts in this different scenario of lockdown. You are doing wonderful work and hearty congratulations for that. And I would like to thank Parag also for giving ICG points in for these events.
Two ICOG, correct.
So,
Chaitanya, Ashwini, excellent talk. Very good discussion.
Thank you.
Best. Thank you, Harshad sir.
Yeah, and I must actually very good talks. IUI is one topic where I think this could just go on. If you just keep the chat open, I think the questions will still keep on pouring in. So I feel
patient might become pregnant by that time.
very good. And thank you, Milind. Thank you, Prakash, for conducting this session excellently. Obviously, Chaitanya and Ashwini, great talks. And thank you, ICOG, for those 2 points. And I just want to remind all our participants of today's meeting, and that we are going to have the next would be on this Thursday, which is on 7th of May, and when we are going to have Padma Shri Dr. Shashank Joshi, who would be speaking on hyperglycemia in pregnancy and endocrinologist perspective. So I invite you all for that topic and for that session also. And once again, thank today's participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.